Welcome. I'm Roland Green, Director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our final event of the year 2020. Today's talk is part of a new online series we launched over the summer called Inside the Center, highlighting current and recent fellows who have done their research and/or their writing under our roof. We want to direct a spotlight on some of the most provocative, groundbreaking, and unusual work that's happening here in the building you see behind me. So welcome to everyone, and especially if you're a former fellow, as I am at the center, joining us today, welcome back. When I became director of the Stanford Humanities Center last year on the eve of our 40th anniversary celebration, it seemed to me a moment to reinforce the center's purpose, to expand our programs and to uphold our distinctive office at Stanford, which is to bring the freshest, the most exciting ideas in the broader humanities to our campus, and now online to share them with the rest of the world. Among other things, we've launched 4 series of new events, one highlighting Stanford faculty research, one introducing major emerging paradigms in the broader humanities, and one featuring figures whose research lends itself to social justice. With this particular series, Inside the Center, which was our first foray into online programming, we want to show how exciting intellectual work is being made in philosophy, music, art history, and all the humanities disciplines, specifically at the center. And we want to devote special attention to works in progress. Before I introduce today's speaker, Niloofar Haeri, I want to mention that today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. And also, if you'd like to submit a question to the speaker, please use the Q&A box in Zoom, and we'll do our best to get to it after the lecture. Now, let me tell you a bit about Professor Haeri, who was a Humanities Center Fellow in the year 2015-16. Today, she'll be discussing her brand new book, Say What Your Longing Heart Desires, Women, Prayer, and Poetry in Iran. Professor Haeri is chair of the Department of Anthropology and director of the program in Islamic Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. Her first book, The Sociolinguistic Market of Cairo, Gender, Class, and Education in Egypt, was about the role of gender in language change in vernacular and classical Arabic. Her second book, Sacred Language, Ordinary People, Dilemmas of Culture and Politics in Egypt, published in English in 2003 and in Arabic in 2011, examined the implications of attempts since the 19th century to modernize classical Arabic. She's edited volumes on Arabic linguistics and on language modernization across the Muslim world. She's the editor of a special section of the journal How, the Journal of Ethnographic Theory, which appeared 3 years ago, where the Protestant notion of sincerity is put in conversation with other religious traditions. The new book, Say What Your Longing Heart Desires, explores how prayer and poetry are used as grounds for high-stakes debates on who is a true Muslim, a debate that is omnipresent in the public sphere in post-revolutionary Iran. At the same time that she worked on the book at the Stanford Humanities Center, Professor Haeri also had the support of a fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation. Niloofar, thank you for joining us today, and it's a great thrill to welcome you back to the center, even in this virtual format.
Thank you so much, Roland, for this invitation. I'm happy to be with you. I really enjoyed my fellowship year at the center. The center really helped me in completing this book. So thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for attending this talk. I really wish I could see you, but we're all having to do with virtual interactions these days. In any case, I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then I look forward to our conversation afterwards. As I was preparing this talk, I asked myself, in what context will my audience hear what I have to say? And in what context will they be able to make sense of my research? The fact is that there is a great deal of negative media about Iran, and there's also a paucity of images. If people think of the country at all, images that come to mind are of scowling clerics, laboratories with centrifuges, and black-clad women covered from head to toe. Such images do capture certain realities in the country, but leave a great deal out. I hope that in this talk, I can help expand ideas about contemporary Iran and make those recurring images lose their starkness. I teach a course on Iran every fall at my university and ask my students to choose an image from the country and its peoples and bring it to class. So we have these weekly discussions about their images. For this talk, I thought it would be a good idea to choose a few of the images that my students chose, what they found interesting and compelling, and show them to you. So I'm getting help in showing the slides. Patricia, could you show the first slide? Thank you very much. Here we have university students just before the revolution. Next one, please. This is a photograph of a village in the north of Iran in the Caspian Sea. Next one. This is a children's television show. One of my students became very interested in it, and so he brought it to class. Here we have a photograph of two people sharing a meal together. This is post-revolution. Next one, please. Yeah, here we have people voting. As you can see, in this one, no one is wearing a mask, but in the next one, you'll see that it's also about voting, but there's a mask. And I think that my students were thinking very much about elections when they chose these photographs. Thanks very much. So between 2008 and 2016, I did fieldwork in Tehran with a group of middle-class educated Muslim women, most of whom were born in the 1940s, though a few were younger. The majority taught in public high schools, and by the time I met them, they were retired. In 2008, I was actually in the middle of a project comparing notions of modesty among Iranian Muslims, Jews, and Christians. Serendipitously, as it often happens in fieldwork, I chanced upon conversations on ritual prayer, not among the usual suspects, such as male clerics or highly educated elites, but among people who have historically not been offered seats at tables of theological debate. The more I listened to these conversations, the more intrigued I became, both because they were intellectually interesting, but also because I was listening to debates with actual high stakes, stakes having to do with how women and men were to dress in public, about praying or not praying in prayer rooms that the state came to impose on public institutions, about whether a prayer without sincerity has much worth, even if from the point of view of religious law, it is a valid prayer, about the true seat of piety. Is it the invisible heart or the visible performance of religious acts in mosques and out in public? I was not used to, nor did I expect to run into theological debates in the public sphere on such a massive scale and among non-clerics. The revolution of 1979 ended the monarchy of the Pahlavi regime and forced the Shah out of Iran. An Islamic Republic was established after a controversial referendum that was carried out in March 1979. And before Iranians could scratch their heads and catch their breaths about the implications of such momentous changes in their society, Saddam Hussein attacked Iran in September 1980, and the Iran-Iraq War began. This was a mutually devastating 8-year war, and we will never know what trajectory the revolution would have taken had the war not started so quickly after the revolution. After the war, as daily life found some stability, Iranian society turned toward itself. There was a reflexive turn, a renewed interest in the country's cultures, history, religion, literature, music, and so on. For that reason, and as public places of entertainment got increasingly curtailed, a whole slew of informal classes popped up in people's homes and in neighborhood cultural centers. It must be said that Iranians have been fond of all kinds of get-togethers for centuries. And so getting together to talk about and be taught by someone about poets, mystics, the Quran, Persian music, singing, and other matters of interest was only a step away from what they had been doing all along. I began meeting people, women who were willing to talk to me about their namaz, that is, the ritual prayer. This is the first subject that interested me, and I followed them to their weekly Quran and poetry classes. By the time I met them, they had been going to these classes for years, if not decades. Discussions in these classes were prime examples of the reflexive moment that I just mentioned. It seemed to me that there was a sort of mass education in theology that was taking place. In print media, television, radio, and websites and gatherings, there was this question on the table. What kind of Islam should Iranians strive for? What is true Islam? Who is a true Muslim? What are the ethics of being a Muslim? Because after the revolution, Iranians ended up with an Islamic republic that wanted to tell people, and often coercively so, the correct way to be a Muslim in all ways, from what one wore to what one drank, how prayers were to be performed, the question of Islam moved into the public sphere. As I became increasingly drawn into these debates, I began also to ask myself, well, what does it mean to be religious in the first place? I think it's important for those who are not religious, consider themselves secular, atheist, or anti-religious, to actually pose this question and not assume that they know the answer. Like everything else, the question requires research and reflection with an open mind. Now, in the last few decades, we've been reading and hearing from those in the media, as well as in academia, that the revolution in Iran was an utter failure, that it took Iranian society backward instead of forward toward enlightenment and progress. It is not that some of these kinds of characterizations are false. It is that they prevent us from discovering changes that were set in motion that are crucial in understanding contemporary Iran. I urge in my book that we avoid looking at revolutions in terms of either success or failure. This enables us then to be open to discovering developments that are unexpected and that no one had really planned. What the revolution brought forth, along with increases in literacy, availability of sources, informal classes, is that non-elite people, the laity, historically called the avam as opposed to the khawas, entered the debate about Islam. In fact, the revolution helped blur this distinction and greatly decreased its historical starkness. Among the many questions that were being debated was one that continues to receive endless attention. What is the status of any religious act if it is not done with sincerity and with what is called presence of the heart? What good is it to pray and fast if one then goes on to cheat and lie? What is most interesting about these and similar questions is that they are not new. They have been with Muslims for centuries. But the revolution, as I just mentioned, greatly increased their stakes. The stakes of what particular answers the state and then the various groups of citizens would actually give to such questions. Now, the many impositions of state institutions could have resulted in an entirely polarized population, pro-regime, anti-regime, pro-Islam, anti-Islam. But what happened is that across class and gender lines, many groups of people began to engage by going to classes, exchanging with others, finding ways of forming their ideas of different kinds of religiosity. So they did not cede the grounds of religion to the state by washing their hands off of the whole matter. The question of Islam became an existential one as the Republic set out to produce Homo Islamicus, a visibly pious citizenry. Perhaps the reflexive turn and the coercive measures of the state came to be in some ways two sides of the same coin. Of course, there was also disengagement and outright rejection. So I don't mean to imply that everyone participated in the same kinds of exploring and searching, but many did. And my interest is with the kinds of debates that they generated. Now, one can ask, well, with what conceptual and terminological resources did the laity, the awam, engage in these debates? The one that I describe in my book at some length is the vast body of mystic writing in Iran. Usually, people become familiar with mysticism or irfan, as it's called in Iran, through poetry and songs. They may read various philosophers and theologians, but it is mostly through hearing, reciting, and being taught poems, where they learn concepts and vocabulary with which to construct arguments about the nature of piety. Because of the dominance of mystic thought in classical poetry, I use both terms interchangeably. The poetry is also taught in secondary education, textbooks for Persian literature from about 1959, when my interlocutors in this study were in high school, to the 2000s are full of poems, including those of Rumi, Saadi, and Hafez. What I suggest is that mystic poetry has been a companion to the world of prayer in the cultural history of Iran in the last many centuries. And that relationship of companionship exists also in the lives of many Iranians, including the women I worked with. Classical poetry is viewed as a source of inexhaustible knowledge that remains accessible to various degrees to non-specialists. You never hear someone say, well, I just finished reading Rumi, now I'm going to go read Hafez, and after I finish Hafez, you don't finish with them. You read them over and over across a lifetime. The major poets of this tradition continue to be interlocutors and are alive and present, hayyu hazer, as I was told repeatedly during my fieldwork. So how has this poetry remained accessible? In part, it has remained accessible because Persian has not changed so drastically since the time of Rumi and even before. One does not need to expend much time in learning, say, an archaic version of Persian in order to read this poetry. Just to give a comparative example, Chaucer and Hafez are both from the 14th century. But for English speakers, Chaucer is quite hard to read and follow today, whereas Hafez, though he may be conceptually hard at times, uses language that is not so different from contemporary Persian. Rumi, who precedes Hafez by a century, often sounds startlingly contemporary. So one of the most interesting features of Persian mystic poetry, perhaps quite consciously, is that the language tends far more toward the vernacular rather than rigid and flowery archaic genres. During the summer months when I did fieldwork in Tehran, in one of the classes I attended, they were reading Rumi's Masnavi. The Masnavi is a 6-volume work that has hundreds of pedagogic stories in verse and often in the form of dialogues between characters. I was lucky to be present when one of the most beloved and well-known stories of the Masnavi, that is called Moses and the Shepherd, was being read. Now, in my book, in order to stage the theological exchanges that were taking place, I use Moses and the Shepherd and return to it in each chapter. Let me recount a very abridged version of it for you. Could we go to slide 9? Thank you. Moses overhears a shepherd talking to someone. The shepherd is saying, "Where are you so I may take out the lice from your hair so I can sew shoes for you, give you my goat's milk?" Moses asks him, "Who are you talking to?" And the shepherd replies that he's talking to the Creator. Moses then scolds the shepherd and tells him to not talk to God like that. God is not your uncle, he tells him. He's in no need of milk or shoes. The shepherd becomes despondent upon hearing this and runs to the desert. Could we go to slide 10? God sends a revelation to Moses. "You have separated me from one of my own. Did you come as a prophet to unite or to sever? I have given each individual a nature. I have given each individual expression. Hindus praise me in the Hindi tongue. Sindhis praise me in the Sindhi tongue. I am not made pure by their remembrance, but pure, full of pearls, do they become. We have no regard for words or qal. We look at their spirit and hal." The rhyming pair hal and qal is used here. Qal means that which is expressed, language, and hal is a major concept in mysticism, in Persian mysticism, that refers to a fleeting state where one is suddenly overwhelmed by an inexplicable joy, or even sadness, where one feels, if only for a moment, the presence of the divine, one's connection to something larger, to the universe, to nature. God says, what matters is what is in the heart, not the kind of language the shepherd used in talking to me. The shepherd was in hal. That's what's important. Moses then runs to the desert and finds the shepherd. Could we see the next slide? Moses tells the shepherd, "هیچ آدابی و ترتیبی مجو، هرچه میخواهد دل تنگت بگو." In English, "Do not search for manners and rules. Say what your longing heart desires." Now, the question is, how does this 13th century story get woven into politics today and into understandings and practices of religious acts? I will turn to these questions next. In 2014, Moses and the Shepherd became a major flashpoint when a well-known supporter of the Republic, Hujjatul Islam Qaraati, who is in fact the director of the National Namaz Organization and has his own television show, attacked Rumi for suggesting that the prophet ought not to interfere in the shepherd's relationship with God. He called Rumi an anti-prophet and went on to defend Moses against God. Quote, "Prophets came in order to prevent such nonsense," end of quote. In response, Ayatollah Yunesi, who is the special advisor to the President for Minority Affairs, said, quote, "Worship is a relationship of the individual to God. It does not matter in what language or style. Mulavi," that's Rumi, wanted to illuminate one truth, and that is the bond between the human being and God. End of quote. There were many reactions to this exchange in the media. Websites were busy talking about it. You can see the interest in this on the part of pro-regime officials and media figures. Clerics must intervene and tell others how to be a Muslim. What else? So this is what I mean by the continued sway and relevance of mystic ideas used as references that many can follow, disseminated through poetry in today's debate about true Islam. Incidentally, this very poem is included in the literature textbook for second and third year high school students. In my book, I give similar examples of public disagreements using stories from the body of mystic writing, but I would like now to move on to ritual prayer and spontaneous prayer. I referred earlier to serendipitous conversations that changed my research topic. Here, I'd like to share one with you that was perhaps the earliest spark for my interest in this research. In the summer of 2008, I went to visit a relative in Tehran. When the sound of the call to prayer came on, she asked me to watch television while she went to her room to pray. When she came back, she said her prayer that evening had gone well and she felt close to God. This puzzled me. I grew up in a religious family where my parents prayed. My grandfather was an Ayatollah whose busy and large household we frequently visited. So I had grown up in an environment where there was no shortage of people praying. And yet, I had never reached the stage of becoming conscious of my not having ever asked myself, what does it mean to pray? How could a ritual prayer go well or badly? A ritual is a scripted act. The performer is not the author. She's told what to say and do, and that's about it. And also, what is a ritual when it is performed alone? What is it like when it is performed in a room of one's own? Could we go to the next slide? Oh, thank you. No, please stay, go back. Thank you. I didn't realize you're there. The ritual prayer in Persian is called namaz, in Arabic is called salat, and each one of the ritual prayers start with this chapter of the Quran, which is called Al-Fatiha. In the name of God, the compassionate, the caring, praise be to God, Lord, sustainer of the worlds, the compassionate, the caring, master of the day of reckoning. To you we turn to worship, and to you we turn in time of need. Guide us along the road straight, the road of those to whom you are giving, not those with anger upon them, not those who have lost their way. Believing Muslims must do the namaz at dawn, noon, afternoon, evening, and night. These are of different durations because they are composed of 2 to 4 prayer cycles. After the opening that starts each prayer, which I just shared with you, other similarly short surahs from the Quran follow. So here we have the quintessence of the appearance of a ritual that can become rote and mindless. The words are not authored by the reciter, they are fixed, and the verses are repeated 5 times a day. But do fixity and lack of authorship block the imagination of the performer and prevent her critical faculties from reflecting on what she's doing? I argue at length in my book that the answer to all these questions is no. There are many reasons for this. One is that in ritual, the reciter's relationship to the language is not the same as if she were reading the text like a book. Reciting from memory in the course of a ritual is a different activity from reading and interpreting a text. For this reason, the relationship that the reciter builds over time with the ritual is not predicated exclusively on what the language actually says. It is also predicated on that, but what the language actually says goes in and out of focus, in and out of how important the actual meaning is. Hence, also the relationship between form and content in a ritual is not constant. The forms are fixed, but not the imagination of the reciter, and her daily contexts and moods completely affect the performance of this ritual. The other thing to consider is that we are used to thinking that with repetition, language loses its meaning, and the performance of religious rituals become rote. While that can happen at times, it's not automatically the case. Imagine a cello player practicing Bach's cello suites. We would never say that because the player has not composed the suites and keeps repeating them every day, her performance becomes rote. On the contrary, as she continues to practice, she creates a presence in her performance. And at some point, the listener can even hear her particular presence and distinguish between her performance and someone else's. A similar kind of expertise and exchange with that which is performed happens with namaz. What my interlocutors call a good namaz is one where they're able to achieve presence of the heart and can possibly even become co-present with the divine in the sacred time space of the prayer. Another thing that's crucial to namaz and similar rituals is that each time the reciter stands to pray, she does not know how that particular session will go. Where will she end up emotionally? Where will she be able to concentrate? Will she be able to tell God what she wants? Again, that's also the case with a musician, a dancer, an athlete. At the beginning of each performance, he or she cannot know how matters will unfold. This is in part what makes them an attractive challenge. Finally, and because of what I just said, each performance of a repeated ritual is open. It is open to new experiences, new feelings, new ideas that transpire. So, in short, a repetition does not make something predictable. Secular Iranians seem to think that believers stand up rigidly and parrot the words of the Quran, which are in Arabic and not the language of the performer. Therefore, those who pray do not understand what they're saying and have no critical faculties to deploy in order to reflect on what they're doing. Not too unlike secular intellectuals, many clerics argue that for the laity, there is no need for presence of the heart or for making a connection to the divine, as long as the reciter does the ablutions, utters the intention formula, recites the surahs correctly, their prayer is legally valid. But the women in my group, as well as many others, disagree with both assertions. As one of the women told me, could we see the next slide? Thank you. I do not think I'm obliged to pray in the morning, noon, and night. And to be frank, it has been years that I no longer have this belief. Because in general, I feel that it is me who has the need to pray. It is not the great God that has any need for my praying. I like very much to begin my day whenever I wake up 8 or 5 in the morning and say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, that is in the name of God, the caring, the compassionate, and do my namaz. And then she added, Hich adabi o tartibi maju har che mikhahat dil tangat begu. So again, she goes back to what Moses told the shepherd. Now, let's see what our poets have said about a rote prayer, about one done in front of others in order to show off one's piety, and about being too concerned with details, with the formal details of namaz. Here are 3 examples. Could we go to the next slide? Thank you. So from Rudaki in the 10th century, we have what God accepts from you are love's transports, but prayer said by rote, he won't admit. From Saadi, 12th century, it is the key to the gate of hell, that namaz that you perform in front of others. From Rumi in the 13th century, this is a part of his poem, is the prayer of the drunken, tell me, is this prayer valid? For he does not know the timing and is not aware of places. Did I pray for 2 full cycles? Or is this perhaps the 8th one? And which surah did I utter? For I have no tongue to speak it. So you can see that the discourse about rituals, about piety, sincerity, hypocrisy, legal validity has been with us for centuries, and the discourse continues today. Now, I'd like to move on to another kind of prayer, one that is not obligatory, unlike namaz. It has no fixed forms. It's a spontaneous conversation with God, and it's in Persian. In fact, exactly what the shepherd was doing when he was talking to God. This prayer is called dua. One can do dua anywhere and anytime. I asked my interlocutors to describe their dua and whether there are some dua sessions that have turned out to be somehow or other unforgettable. Curiously, many of the examples they gave me were of times when their relationship with God had become strained and at times even seen a complete rupture. Here is a description I was given by one of my interlocutors, and I have shortened it. She said, my husband was at the hospital and I had lost my job. It was a really vulnerable moment in my relationship with God. I was feeling so terrible on that day. I was walking down the street and I suddenly saw a mosque. I decided to go inside, but it was locked. So I started banging on the door. Eventually, the caretaker came out and said, Khanum, what is going on? What do you want? I said, open the door of the mosque. I want to go in. A mosque is the house of God. You have no right to close its doors. So he opened the door and I went into the Shabestan, the prayer hall. He let me be alone. I started shouting and crying. God, what is going on? What are you making me go through? Please help me. I need help. I'm pleading with you. I think in that moment, I really had lost my mind. I was not in control and I was ranting. Okay, that was our last slide. We can stop sharing. These and similar descriptions were rather startling to me. We are so used to expecting the theological categories that we are repeatedly told about. How is it that God is addressed in such intimate terms? One of the verses of the Quran that is explicitly taught to Muslims since childhood and repeatedly quoted is that God is not born, nor has he given birth. In English, I have to say he. In Persian, in the third person singular, we don't have he or she. So, but here I have to use he. We are told he's a completely different being to humans. But were it the case that while the woman that I just read to you about, while she was shouting at God and asking him to account for himself, she thought of him across that utter ontological divide. Would she have talked in that way? What I found is that in dua, God is addressed as being close and within earshot of one's emotions, including anger. I argue that this in part is a result of the way in which God has been talked about, addressed, and conceptualized in mystic thought. In countless poems where God is referred to as the beloved. And as the beloved, he can be asked to explain himself. A second interesting aspect of dua is that it often exceeds the theological categories that we have. We cannot easily characterize the content as, say, gratitude, praise, petitionary, etc. Dua can meander and become unpredictable even to the reciter. Of course, people do talk to God with these aims, but often, and especially when they become adept at addressing him, the conversation goes in unexpected directions that are difficult to name and maybe even to tame. I argue in my book that one's relationship with God goes through ups and downs. He actually is not always across an ontological divide, and that in different religious acts, God is treated differently. Let me bring my talk to a close by describing briefly the rest of my book. I have shared with you parts of chapters 2 and 3. I would now like to tell you about chapters 1, 4, and the conclusion. In chapter 1, I begin with an ethnography of the place of classical poetry in the lives of these women. I start from their childhood when they were encouraged to memorize poems and perform them for adults, and also to participate in the very popular poetry contests taking place at their schools, on radio, and later on television, called Moshaere. What is significant about growing up with classical poetry is that it is a complex and multidimensional kind of education. Much of this poetry is about religion, piety, divine and erotic love, hypocrisy, and ethics. It offers vocabulary, social types, reams of paradoxical scenarios and images in some social and philosophical analysis through which one becomes tutored in the ways of religion and of the world. I also try to analyze why this poetry was and remains so appealing over decades of people's lives. Chapter 4 examines the print culture of prayer books and the role of women and the younger generation in expanding the ideas of what constitutes a prayer and thereby changing the liturgy. In my concluding chapter, I offer a few more ethnographic examples of the kinds of probing that about religion that I was told by my interlocutors are new, matters that their parents did not seem to reflect on as much as they are reflecting. For example, one woman said that she changes a word or two in a Quranic verse when she recites it in order to reflect her own thinking better. Another said that in reciting her namaz, she says one verse in Persian and one in Arabic, or at times all of it in Persian. These are controversial acts, as the namaz is supposed to be entirely in Arabic. By way of a conclusion, I suggest that such social changes are important to study in detail, even when we could say that politically the revolutionary project has dashed many hopes. The kind of literacy in religion that the revolution has sparked will help bring about a more articulate and informed vision about the role of religion in the political future of the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niloofar. That was a gorgeous talk. And I have so much admiration for the way that you make it so accessible, even as you're dealing with such fundamental questions of religious practice. That's just beautifully done.
Thank
To our audience, which is a very large audience right now, let me again invite you, if you have questions for Professor Haeri, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A function on Zoom. They will be passed along to me, and I will try to get to as many of them as we can in the time that remains. But as we get underway the question period here, let me start first by asking you, Niloofar, a question about, let me start from the center and move outward. So let me start with something very close to the center of the project, which is your contact with the group of interlocutors that you refer to as the women in my group.
Yeah.
Clearly, there is a generational aspect to this project. That is to say that the women you're focused on are set apart in some ways, perhaps, from others by virtue of generation. There's a moment early on in the book in which you say the generation of Iranian women born around the 1940s is an unusual generation. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I don't mean to say they're unusual. I want to say they're important. That generation is a significant generation. The reason is that in the world in which they grew up, as they were becoming adolescents and adults in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a major expansion of public education, of professional vocational schools, of the government bureaucracy really expanded, and the world was opening up to women to become independent, to get a salary, get a job, and so on. So they became school teachers, they became nurses, soon after that, doctors. They went to all kinds of training schools. And so what happened is that this is a generation that I think played a very important role in shaping the generations that were coming after them. They played a very big role. They, in the time they were growing up, as one historian has said, the question of women became a debate rather than an accepted fact. Before that, you could say it was more or less accepted, women have to stay home and raise their children. But while they were growing up, this question actually became a debate. So I think it was an important time, and they played a very important role.
Is there something in their specifically in their education that oriented them toward poetry in this way? Is there anything that you can imagine that was sort of in the background of their training?
What was in their background mostly actually was their childhood at home more than their education, because you see, these women have studied all kinds of things: chemistry, biology, mathematics, a few literature, but a majority of them actually did not study literature. They went to, the other thing that is special about them is that they're the first generation who went to college. They got a college degree. But what happened is that, as I try to show in my ethnography, as children in their homes, they were raised with poetry. They were encouraged to memorize poetry. And, there's something very interesting about memorizing poetry that's not intended for children. It's like when, a 7-year-old plays, classical music. I mean, it was not intended for a 7-year-old. But what I found really fascinating is that as children, they made a connection to a few lines that they memorized. They may not have quite understood the meaning, but they liked it. It was an aesthetic pleasure. It was an aesthetic pleasure, and a very nice experience. And so what happens is that it doesn't so much matter that as children, they may not quite understand, say, a poem from Rumi, but the fact of memorizing it, being able to say it, recite it beautifully, and perform it for others, there is something in that education, right? So that, I think, was in the background.
I want to come back to that phenomenon of the children reciting canonical adult poetry by rote, and what kind of cultural formation is going on in an episode like that. But I'm going to come back to that when we talk more about the poetry. I also want to point out something that's obvious about the project, and you deal with it quite strikingly in the introduction, which is that you're describing a phenomenon that is obviously gendered. There's a moment in the introduction in which you sketch a kind of unforgettable scene in which some of these women are organizing poetry groups in their homes, and the men are like in the next room, and have no similar interest in this poetry. And so you've got sort of two groups organized by gender, one very poetry oriented and one seemingly going about their everyday business alongside. What accounts for the gendered difference here? That the fact that the men of the same generation seem not to have the same degree of interest in this poetry.
Right. Actually, the main gender difference that I saw was in relation to organizing gatherings to recite prayers. There you see a very big difference. Women organize these kinds of gatherings frequently. They very much enjoy them. They cook together, they sing together, and so on. But that kind of gathering to recite poetry, to celebrate, say, for example, the Prophet's birthday and so on, men do that much less. When I went to gatherings that were not intended to be only for women, for example, in cultural centers, there were many men. So I think in poetry, the difference is not so gendered. But in these gatherings where you recite prayers and so on, it's a more gendered matter.
Okay, now this is a question from the audience. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I'm curious how the kind of virtuosity practiced by your interlocutors affects their perception of the clerical establishment. What kinds of authority to instruct, to interpret, to lead namaz for others do they validate through their collective encounters in the study circles?
Right. It's actually quite interesting, and it would take a long time to fully answer the question. But I interviewed a quite well-known, what is called in Iran, religious intellectual, Roshan Fikr Dini, Muhammad Mujtahid Shabestari, who has written a great deal on Islam and its history. And he said to me, and I agree with him, that after the revolution, the whole question of authority was very much transformed. I'm almost quoting him, he was saying, it's no longer the case that you say such and such Ayatollah said such and such, and then people say, oh, okay, so that's the way it must be. Authority has, as I tried to say, it's, the laity have entered into the debates on religion. And so, for example, when women get together and read parts of the Quran, although often there can be a teacher, but it isn't this stark difference where the teacher has authority, they don't have authority. Actually, what happens is that because the Quran is translated into Persian, most people that go to gather around or go to classes have bilingual Qurans. And so one person reads, let's say, a couple of verses, and then they read the translation, and inevitably the translations are different in different editions. And so they end up in this very interesting hermeneutic debate about which translation is better, which translation is more apt. And they don't think that because they are laity, they ought not to pass this, ought not to engage in this kind of discussion. So I hope that partly answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. Here's another member of the audience who wants you, I think, to elaborate on something that I think you talk about it in the book, but I don't think you said much about it in the talk. So maybe you can elaborate. He writes, I love the comparison of a performer or athlete to the person in prayer. How did your interlocutors describe prayer experiences that either turned out well or poorly? How does one assess how a prayer turns out?
Yes, that's a really wonderful question. So let me give you an example. This is the kind of example that turned me to this these questions about a prayer going bad or a prayer not going well. I began talking with a woman I met in one of these gatherings, and I was telling her, I'm a researcher, I'm interested in namaz, can I talk to you about namaz and so on. And the very first thing she said to me was, oh, I'm not at all satisfied with my namaz these days. It was really quite startling. And so she went on to explain why she wasn't satisfied with her namaz. Something had happened that had completely taken away her concentration. And so what happened is that each time she wanted to pray, her mind would wander. And in fact, many of these women say that the first thing for a namaz to be good and successful is that you must be able to concentrate, but that concentration is quite hard. So, so they would describe the concentration as the most important thing, but that many things could happen. Some very momentous things, some things that were very banal, like suddenly they would look up and see that, that part of the wall needs a lick of paint, and it would just take their concentration away. But what was important is that they would say to me, for example, this chapter that we begin each prayer with, I would say, yes. They would say, well, this doesn't always mean the same thing. And I would think, what do you mean this doesn't always mean the same thing, right? Because it's the same, fixed form. Well, they would say, well, it depends on what stage of your life you're in. Are you 18? Are you 70?
Mm-hmm.
That makes a very big difference. What mood are you in? What has happened in your life? So you have these experiences where you stand to do exactly the same thing, say exactly the same words, but your experiences are different. And it made me think of the performer of any routine or any script that the performer has not authored. What happens in that duration.
And I want to ask specifically about the feelings that they would express to you that accompany a prayer that did not turn out well.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a vocabulary for that, or is there a way that did they recognize that experience within the group across, from one person to another? Is there a kind of shared understanding of what that means or what that entails?
Yes. Actually, both when I interviewed them individually. And I also organized, gatherings, as I was saying, we all like gatherings, where we all talk together and share the meal. And people would extensively talk about, they would say, these days, I'm very unsatisfied. That's the word, narazi. I'm razi nistam. I'm not satisfied with my namaz. I can't concentrate. I feel like I'm going a bit far from God. There is so much happening. My mind is very, full of things that are distracting me, and so on. So they talk about that quite a lot. And then they talk about how to return to a place where they could again do a namaz. Sometimes when they're not satisfied, they stop the namaz right in the middle. They just, people explain to me, after saying a few of the chapters, they would realize, my God, I don't even know which surah. Just like Rumi says, which surah am I? Is it the second one, the eighth one? So they would just stop and sit down and take a break and try to gather their thoughts. Maybe they wouldn't even go back to that prayer that day, that evening. They would go back the next day. Because again, it's important to be able to interact with it, to concentrate, to reflect on it. So if you just keep saying it and your mind is somewhere else, it's a major source of dissatisfaction.
Here's another question that you do explicitly talk about in the introduction of the book, but to share with the online audience. How did you select your interlocutors, and how do you think your research was affected by your relationships with these women?
Right. So I basically, once I sort of knew a few questions to ask, because as I said, I was doing some other research, so I barely had, very articulate questions to ask. Basically, I, met a few women, and then I would go to their classes. In those classes, I would meet more women. They would introduce me to their friends and say, here's a friend of mine, or, the sister of so-and-so, she's doing this kind of research, she wants to talk, and so on. And then, almost each time they would say, yeah, that's great, come to my house, or I can come to yours, and things like that. So I didn't so much select them. I just went to these classes, and it so happened that many of them were more or less in the same generation. Some of them knew each other because they had gone to, they taught in the same high schools, or in high schools that were neighboring each other, so they knew each other. Some of them were distant relatives, and so on. So basically, I talked to anyone who wanted to talk to me. Yeah.
Were there people that didn't want to talk to you about this?
There was one woman who did not want to be recorded. She's from a relatively well-known family, and she talked to me, and it was wonderful to talk to her, but she did not want to be recorded. And there was the woman I just told you who said that she's very unsatisfied with her prayer. She did talk to me twice, but after that, she kind of kept saying, I see a distance between myself and God now. I don't know if I really want to talk about it, but otherwise I was quite lucky.
Another question from the audience, your words on the heart and language and learning by heart also evoke multilingualism. Did the women who worked with you tell you about what it meant to switch between Persian and Arabic? And is the mother tongue closer to what your longing heart desires when praying?
Right. Well, that's an excellent question, but it's difficult to answer in one definitive way because it changes. So, for example, the woman that I described towards the end of my presentation today, who said that she says one verse of the namaz in Arabic and one verse in Persian, and then sometimes she says the whole thing in Persian. Which, it's interesting because a lot of the clerics' websites are full of questions people have sent about, can I use Persian when I'm, reciting the namaz? And usually the answer is no. But in any case, this woman told me, the one who says it in Persian, told me that she feels closer to God when she recites the prayer in Persian. Others who were present, actually, this was a gathering, and others heard that, and they said, for example, the reactions were, well, I would find it kind of odd or difficult to say this in Persian. I'm so used to saying it in Arabic. And it's, I think that reciting the prayer in Arabic probably as compared to doing a prayer in Persian, that the formality of Arabic probably affects it to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, if you have said it so often across your lifetime, I'm not sure about how much that would affect you. I'm hesitating because when you do dua, when you do this kind of spontaneous prayer, I think one of the reasons why God is suddenly not across such an ontological divide is because it's in Persian. You are addressing someone in Persian and you're saying, what are you doing? What do you think you're doing to me? And this kind of thing, which
It's
is
a vernacular relationship. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
which you wouldn't get to do while doing the prayer,
Mm-hmm.
the namaz. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn to a few questions about the poetry itself and the relation of the poetry to these the women in your group. So, I mean, I have a lot of questions about this, and the audience has a number too. And this is, this is a project about poetry treated ethnographically, in a way. This is a book that tells an episode. I'm a poetry scholar, and this book is a literary scholar, and this book tells an episode of something that poetry scholars sometimes talk about, which is that there are, by legend, there are certain countries in the world that have special relationships to poetry. Mm-hmm. That is to say, where unlike other countries where many of the average people on the street know by heart long stretches of canonical poetry of that country. People sometimes say this in Latin America. People sometimes say it about Chile and Nicaragua. In modern Greece, I think Gregory Gistanis has written about that. And Iran is always a country that people refer to in that way. That the penetration of poetry into the its absorption by the populace is unusually deep. Yeah. So first, I want to ask you why you think your informants find this poetry so powerful and so attractive. Is there, in your investigation of it, is it intrinsic to the poetry as poetry? Is it the context in which they first encounter it? Is it something they bring to it? So the question would be something like, what does the poetry do for them? And then what do they do to the poetry?
Right. Thank you for that question. Yeah, this is a very interesting discussion. So on the one hand, they grow up with this poetry. So the context is very important. Who do they learn this poetry from? They learn it from their parents, mostly, but also uncles, aunts, neighbors, maybe, and so on. And so this poetry carries with it an emotional weight that's very important, right? So, almost regardless of what the poetry says, the fact that they have learned from family members, from people that they are emotionally attached to is very important. That context is very important. And then as they grow up and they learn more about the content, they start to be in exchange with poets who lived many centuries ago, but who had similar experiences to them, who felt the same emotions. And people are so touched by the fact that, oh my God, Hafez had this feeling. he had this, Rumi had this experience, same as me, So they are they become interlocutors in that way. And there is also the aspect of that aesthetic pleasure of reciting the poem. And the fact that, once you recite, and this is a culture where you learn to recite well, you don't just stand there rigidly and just, mouth the words. You must, declamer, you must do it well. That aesthetic experience, that aesthetic pleasure, when you grow older, and imagine that you have now recited perhaps the same poem, maybe 100 times, you feel like you're the author. What's interesting about recitation is that the author doesn't remain intact in that moment of recitation. In the moment of recitation, you are the one who is uttering the words, and you, as the person who is uttering, you are almost like an author.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the women told me, it's true that, when I recite a poem, I'm not the author, but I am the one who is expressing it. And I feel like these are now my words while I'm reciting this. So that's also another pleasure. And what happens is that when you recite that way, the pleasure or the pain of the poem gives you a certain audacity. This is what I talk about. The pleasure of audacity, to be audacious, to say words you would never normally say, but you see someone else did, so that's okay. You say that, right? So I talk in my book about this audacity that people like, the fact that they can feel momentarily to be an author, and at the same time they can hide behind the form and saying, well, this is not my poem, I didn't say those things, if ever they get in trouble.
Of course. Right.
I want to say one more thing about what poetry does, and that is it mediates relationships and it defines relationships. If you don't mind, I'm going to, well, maybe instead of reading the narrative, I'll just tell you about it to save time. One of my interlocutors said that, her parents, both of whom knew a great deal of poetry, weren't exactly, on the best of terms all the time. The father was quite absent all the time, the mother, and so on. However, what she described was that, almost every night when they would sit around and have dinner, at some point, either, the father, for example, would start to recite something that fit what was happening. Someone says something, and then you think of a poem that's related to, or to an event or something like that. And then the mother would join in. And then gradually, she described to me that I would look at my mother's face and it had softened. It no longer had that kind of hard look at my father. She was beginning to look at him with admiration. So you see, poetry does this too. It really mediates and defines, even momentarily, relationships.
You put that very well. Thank you. And you also mentioned, though, that well, you do address this in the book, and I think I want to invite you to say a little more for the audience, which is that in addition to these kind of this mediating function that poetry takes in relationships and what it does within individuals, it also, in this context, it encourages a different kind of thinking about religion. There is a moment in which you say that poetry permits, I think this is a quotation, permits the women in these groups to think about religion in imaginative or paradoxical ways. And at the same time, you quote an informant who says, poetry waters our religion. So what's the aspect of thinking religiously that goes on in this genre of poetry?
Right. So you see, the poets who these women read the poets who are so important to Iranian cultural history, they themselves are considered to be the true Muslims, right? They would have never said they are not Muslims, or no one else would say, they're not, although, I quote this Hujjatul Islam who doesn't like Rumi, but they are Muslims. And as Muslims, they are writing about what it is to be religious, what it is to have a relationship with God. And so as these women are growing up, as it happens to other Iranians, they are reading poets who are trying to describe how one ought to construct a relationship with the divine, unmediated, right? So all these kinds of ways in which one does not renounce religion, one does not say, this is terrible, I'm either going to become secular or I'm going to, convert to some other religion. All these ways of being a Muslim, but in ways that are different from what is legal validity, this thing. And in fact, when this woman says, and this is an expression that's used quite a lot, because you see, we have the expression dry piety. So, zohd khushk and mazhab khushk. So dry piety is what more or less characterizes the state. But historically, we've always had to deal with and struggle against dry piety in our history. And so this poetry waters our religion, means that it defines what are its ethics, what are its true ways of having a relationship to the divine, which is more important than the formalities of legal validity of this act or the other act.
And when the women in your groups are experiencing this kind of individual relationship to the divine, I guess it goes without saying, but I just wanted you to make it explicit. It's private. So it can be, they're not publishing theological treatises or broadcasting their unorthodox views from the rooftops, but they're having, through the mediation of poetry, they may be having private thoughts that are in some ways original about the text that they're working with, and therefore about the tradition. And it remains a kind of private one-to-one experience with the divine that may be quite, in some ways, quite unusual or quite unorthodox.
It's probably the case, no, it is the case that in certain ways, these ways of thinking about religion, trying to understand the nature of divinity and so on are private. But what is happening is that there is on the one hand, one could say this agentive deliberation, individually deliberating. But at the same time, they are constantly exchanging in these gatherings, in these weekly gatherings. They're talking to each other, they go to classes, they listen to other classes they have missed. And so there is a lot of exchange, and they share these ideas, just as they share, for example, what they dreamt about, they share ideas of, I was thinking the other day, such and such and such and such. So, and then within the larger context, there is this debate about the kind of Islam and true Islam. And so on the one hand, they do this agentive deliberation with some authority, and at the same time, they talk to each other. So it's difficult to say that it's exclusively private.
Yeah. And one other question related to this from the audience, which is it fair to say, is it possible to say that something about the sense of ownership, this is the word that the questioner uses, of the words by these women when reciting the Arabic words in the Quran as they did in namaz? How would you characterize the difference in their relationship to the language and their possession of it?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I've actually worked on this also when I was doing research in Egypt. And I would say that because the words of the Quran from which the namaz is taken, the chapters of the namaz are taken, parts of namaz, because the language of the Quran is considered to be the word of God and it's considered to be sacred, even Arabs don't own that language.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I argued in my other book on Egypt that Muslims are custodians of the language of the Quran, of the sacred text, but they are not its owners, unlike vernacular languages where speakers are their owners, right? So they don't really take ownership. In fact, there is a fair amount of self-consciousness among Iranians with regard to Arabic. Not only because, there is this whole discourse of the language of heaven is Arabic and so on, but also because they are very aware that given Persian phonology, when they pronounce Arabic, it would almost be unrecognizable to Arabic ears. There's a lot of jokes about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's also this kind of self-consciousness, oh, my Arabic is not great, and so on. So yeah, I would say that there isn't that sense of ownership.
Okay. We're going into the last 10 minutes of the meeting, so let me just wind up with a couple more questions from the audience and maybe one from me. I was wondering if you could say something about, you mentioned at the outset that there was a project before this one that I think you said that was concerned with modesty, and you mentioned in the book that the original project for which you went to Iran to do research got set aside as you discovered these materials and these women, and so this book was the result. Could you tell us a little bit more about the trajectory of how one project turns into another, and especially about what, for the benefit maybe of people listening who are graduate students who are writing dissertations, people who are writing their first book, something about how one negotiates that the fact that a project one had envisioned turns into something very different. And you often have to, as I assume is the case here, learn not only a different corpus of material and different ethnographic evidence, but maybe even different methods and learn from other disciplines that were not part of an earlier project. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that as we head toward the conclusion.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me tell you, I have boxes and boxes of archival material from that project that have been sort of staring at me silently for many years. So yeah, I mean, I became interested in that project in part because there was so much talk at that time about, hijab and the veil and the veil, and I became interested because I wanted to look at it comparatively and historically. I wanted to look at Jewish Iranians, Christian Iranians, Zoroastrian Iranians, because what we forget is that, for example, in 1937. In 1928, Reza Shah banned men from wearing turbans and robes. They had to wear European suits. In 1937, he banned the veil. And we're used to thinking that it was only the Muslim women that were really disturbed by this. But actually, as I was told by my Iranian friends who are not Muslim, that also, their grandmothers and so on were upset because they also covered their heads. And so I thought, maybe it would be good to do something comparative. And I started to look at that. To me, it was a completely different project than what I was used to because I'm trained as a linguist. Mm-hmm. And so that was really quite far off from the kinds of work that I had done. So I was endlessly curious, and I kept gathering material and learning some very interesting things, for example, about the fact that there are such interesting similarities in terms of how the gaze is theorized in Judaism and Christianity. I mean, Judaism and Islam, and to some degree Christianity. So, however, as I was doing that research, I started to think that this is a little bit too far off from what I am better able to conceptualize and think about. And when I chanced upon these conversations, I felt like they were closer to my, not only were they closer to my heart, they were closer to my training.
Mm-hmm.
And so I still have that material,
Mm-hmm.
but I decided to take up this project that I felt, though, I still needed to become familiar with bodies of research and literature that I was not at all familiar with. Still, it was closer to what I could do, I thought. So I changed.
And I gather from the acknowledgments in the book that the period during which you were at the Stanford Humanities Center, which would have been 2015-16, was sort of a pivotal year for this, as you were doing a lot of the, not so much the writing, but the reading for this new book, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, probably I was pretending I was writing, but I was doing a tremendous amount of reading and getting in touch with people who had, different kinds of expertise, and asking them about this question and that question and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. That time was very crucial.
Good. Yeah. Well, we're having as our current fellows know only too well, we're having a challenge under these current conditions of creating for them the kind of incidental encounters with each other that often prove to be so formative in projects like this. If one were, as you were, an anthropologist writing about how a group of informants are using poetry, and you end up having lunch several times a week with poetry scholars and with religion scholars and so on, that can prove to be so formative for a book like this. I assume it probably was in your case. And we are doing our best to create that environment for this year's fellows online, but it's a continuing challenge. But so I'm quite heartened to hear that it made such a difference for you.
Yes.
One last question before we finish, and this is really for me. As a poetry scholar, interrogating an anthropologist about poetry, what kind, from your disciplinary standpoint, what kind of ethnographic evidence is poetry? How is it different from your point of view from the other kinds of work that other kinds of information that one turns up through field work, for instance, or through interviews? How does an anthropologist treat poetry, and what are the difficulties of putting it at the center of a project like this?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question, and it's difficult. One of the difficulties about doing an ethnography of poetry is that you want to understand where it is in someone's life.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to show up and say, could you, recite some poetry for me, and then go write it down.
Mm-hmm.
You want to wait, you want to be around. You have to spend really quite a lot of time with people to see it, to hear it cited when you didn't expect it at all.
Yeah.
And so, one very important thing is the amount of time it takes to hang around and observe, how does poetry come up? In what ways does it come up? Who says what? And so on and so forth. The other thing is that one thing that's very lucky for field work on poetry in Iran is that poetry is read most of the time in a group. As I say, it's congregational. Poetry is not something you read silently in your room. You gather, and inevitably in many gatherings, someone grabs, a book of Hafez or Saadi or Rumi and so on, and they recite by heart. So in gatherings, it's a very good place to see that. Another thing is poetry is performed. So unlike some other genre, say, for example, you're interested in I don't know, the text of the Bible and how people relate to it. It would be difficult if that text never got performed somehow, either as a recitation, as a song, as a storyteller, as, you know, that performance is really important to the ethnography. So what happens is, for me, the poetry was where, when my interlocutors quoted it, talked about it, recited it, performed it, and so on, right? And they told stories, you know, stories of, for example, one of the most interesting stories, which is familiar to most Iranians, is that this woman's father-in-law goes to a bureaucracy, and the bureaucrat there is giving him a really hard time. And so he quotes a poem from Parveen Ehtesami, who is a well-known and beloved Iranian female poet. And so people start to gather around them as he's reciting this poem. The bureaucrat actually knew another poem by the same poet, and so he starts to counter. And then the father-in-law says, no, you're reading it all wrong. And eventually, the bureaucrat relents and, you know, does whatever he was supposed to. And so when I was being told this story, the woman says, you see, this poem really helped my father.
Yeah. So, so we're at the end now, and I just want to conclude by thanking you, Niloofar, for this discussion. It was really a rich conversation, and I'll tell you what I appreciate so much about the new book, Say What Your Longing Heart Desires, is that from an interdisciplinary perspective, you managed to describe so many things that people in other fields, such as literary studies or performance studies, many of the things that we theorize and debate about, you managed to describe from the ground up, as it were, in terms of how these phenomena actually exist in people's lives. And, you know, it's very rare that a book engages with my discipline, coming from a social science perspective, that a book from anthropology or sociology or political science or something like that engages with my discipline in that way and gives me so much to think about and so much to take back to my own work on poetry. So I want to thank you for that. It's really an exceptional book, and and obviously I recommend it strenuously to our audience, because I enjoyed reading it so much and I enjoyed this conversation so much. So thank you for being with us today.
Roland. I really enjoyed the conversation too.
And to our audience, let me just ask you, please hold Thursday, January 21st for our next Inside the Center event featuring Usha Iyer, who is Assistant Professor of Film and Media Studies at Stanford and is currently a Stanford Humanities Center Fellow. She will be discussing her new book, Dancing Women, Choreographing Corporeal Histories of Hindi Cinema. So that's January 21st. And if you're on our mailing list, you will hear about it. But we are adding more events to the calendar all the time. I hope you will join us again in the coming months. And as always, check our website, shc.stanford.edu, for the latest updates. Niloofar, thank you again. Audience, thank you to everybody. All the best for the holidays, and we'll hope you'll join us again in 2021 and hopes for a better year. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.